Well, hello there, and welcome to a new week. We're down to 4 class periods left, so just this week and next week. I hope you had a wonderful General Conference weekend. I sincerely hope that that was a meaningful and a rewarding, enriching experience for you to learn from our leaders and to hear some of the amazing things that are going on. The new proclamation that they gave us, as well as the new temples announced. It's an amazing time to be alive, as well as the sobering reality of what we're facing as things get more intense with the coronavirus. I'm looking forward to this Friday, joining our faith with yours and with hopefully many millions of people in the world as we fast for some breakthrough with this global struggle that we're facing. The timing is beautiful because yesterday on Sunday was Palm Sunday, as was mentioned many times in General Conference, the day when Jesus experienced his triumphal entry. Just on a personal note, many years ago, my wife and I, as we were coming into the Easter season, we decided with our children that we wanted it to be more real to them. We wanted them to have it on their mind a lot more than just Easter morning. So my wife put all of these pictures from the gospel art kit up on the wall in order of the events that take place during this week of the atoning sacrifice. And each of the children would go through and tell the stories of what was going on which day and at about what time. And during that week, they would frequently come up to us and ask, what was Jesus doing right now? Implying, what was going on during his final week on this day at this time. And we would walk them over to the pictures and explain things. I didn't realize how deeply that had sunk in until Easter morning that year. Our little Jarrett was a baby, about a year old at the time, and he was sleeping in his crib in with his 2 older brothers in their room. And early in the morning, he was fussy, and so I went in and picked up this little baby, and it's dark outside. The eastern skyline is just barely starting to turn gray before the dawn. And I'm sitting there dancing around the room with this little baby, calming him down. And I looked up onto the bunk bed, and there was my Jacob, our second son. He was sitting up in bed against the wall, just staring out into the room, looking at me. And it kind of caught me off guard at first. I said, Jacob, what are you doing? Are you awake? And he said, yeah. Dad, do you think that Jesus has resurrected by now? Because you told us he'd be resurrected early in the morning. And I looked outside at the light, and I said, well, probably, because John's account tells us that Mary came to the tomb while it was yet dark and it's empty. So I said, yeah, he's probably resurrected. Why? And Jacob said, oh, good. I wanted to be awake when Jesus rose from the dead. And I realized that this meant a lot more to the children than just looking at pictures and telling a story and connecting it to a time that had sunk a little deeper. And I was very grateful for that. Now, that same Jacob, we sent out on a mission back in August of 2018, and he was scheduled to come home end of July this year, but he was sent home along with all the other missionaries from the U.S. and Canada on Friday. We picked him up early in the morning, so it's been a crazy couple of days welcoming him home. And so I apologize. I haven't been as good at responding to some of the emails and requests and communications, but we'll get back in the saddle again as we finish out this semester. Uh, I do have to say this, though. Just know that there are so many things going on in the world, and this little experience of worrying about getting Jacob safely out of Guayaquil, Ecuador, and home. There are a lot of beautiful parallels to your earthly experience and being rescued, so to speak, and returned to the arms of safety. There's a nice symbol to the overarching plan of salvation for each of us contained in that as well. Now, before we jump into today's lesson, I need to just make you aware this week the SMART project report is due. So you don't have to spend any more time working on your project, but you do need to follow the directions that the TAs have provided on how to submit your SMART report. So that's all in Learning Suite. And if you have any questions, email Tyler Quaranti, the TA, and he'll walk you through any of those issues. And then next week, in place of doing the SMART project report or anything like that, you'll just get the points for that part of your grade based on doing the student ratings for this class. Okay, so today we're going to be doing the burial and resurrection, the appearances, the commission, and the ascension of Christ. We're going to start with a little overview here, just so we're put on the same page. So stick with me as I pull up the iPad again. Okay. Here we go. What you have is, let me do it this way. This represents kind of the sun's path through one day. So roughly 6 a.m. sunrise and 6 p.m. sunset. So you can kind of get the idea of this is the trajectory of the sun working its way through the sky. Here's 12 noon, the high point of the sun. Here's 9 a.m. and here's 3 p.m. So let's just orient really quickly to make sure we're back on the same page. Jesus is tried before the Sanhedrin in the middle of the night here. Early in the morning, he's taken to Pilate. So the judgments before Pilate, and then Herod, and then back to Pilate, and the scourging and the final condemnation, those are all taking place sometime in these earlier morning hours. According to Mark, he's placed on the cross at 9 a.m. That's when the crucifixion actually takes place. And he's having some of those statements that we covered last time here in these early parts. And then at noon, we're told that the thick darkness gathers and the weight of Gethsemane returns from about noon to 3 p.m. while he's on the cross. And Elder Talmage once again used the word intensified, with all that's implied with that suffering on the cross combined with the weight of Gethsemane. So then he rises up, and it's here where he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And then you probably get the I thirst, and it is finished. Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. So Jesus is going to die sometime very shortly. We don't know exactly when, but sometime very shortly after 3 p.m. This is kind of significant because from the Jewish perspective, whenever the sun sets here in the evening at roughly 6 p.m., maybe a little bit after that, that starts the new day. So this is all Friday. And so the next day is going to be Saturday, which is the Sabbath day. And so it's a big deal to them that there not be any dead bodies or dying people on the cross during the Sabbath day. According to John's timeline as well, where he differs from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, saying that this Saturday is going to be more than a special day. It's going to be a high Sabbath, because it's not only the Sabbath day, that happens every week, but it's also the Passover combined with that, where they eat the Passover meal that night after the sun sets. So over here in this far corner. Because of that, they go. The leaders of the Jews go to Pilate and say, "Hey, you can't leave those bodies on the cross. You need to kill them, those people, and get them off the cross." That's why the soldiers come and they break the legs of the thieves somewhere here. We don't know the exact times, and then they come to Jesus, notice that he's already dead, and they drive the spear into his side, and out comes water mingled with blood. And then it's Joseph of Arimathea who goes to Pilate and begs to be allowed to take the body of Jesus down rather than having the Roman soldiers just take it down and treat it very uncivilly. And he's given that opportunity. And I don't know if you've ever stopped to think about this, but we owe a debt of gratitude to Joseph of Arimathea. And John includes Nicodemus in that list of people who went and helped get the body of Jesus off the cross. And by the time this is all happening, you're getting close to sunset, and you can't be interacting with the body itself during the Sabbath day. And so they are hurrying as fast as they can to get his body off the cross, clean it up as best they can, wrap it up, and put it into the tomb, which happens to be a brand new tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea, and it's never had anyone in it before. Now, let me just give some quick details so that we're all on the same page as far as what burial practices were like in the first century. What happens is you bring in you have 72 hours, you have 3 days from the time a person dies. You're allowed 3 days. They don't want to go on to day 3 if they can help it, but they have up to that amount of time. It's pretty simple to understand because after 3 days, the body starts to noticeably decay. So what they're going to do is they're going to prepare the body in a tomb. Now, this is only for rich people. Poor people don't get tombs. They just get buried in the ground. They're buried in a normal grave. But rich people, and it was prophesied by Isaiah that he would make his death with the rich, in that he's going to be given a very unique burial, where if you're buried in a tomb, it has 2 chambers. Okay, so in one side of the tomb, you have the bed where you can place the body, and you prepare it with spices and with myrrh and ointments, and you clean it, and then you wrap it up as best you can with cloth, burial cloth, and the burial napkin for the head, and you then leave the tomb and you seal up the tomb with a rock, a big rock, and then you paint the outside of the sepulcher white. So if you see a tomb that is painted white, you know that there is a freshly dead body inside of that tomb. That's why Jesus is going to call the Pharisees and some of the chief priests whited sepulchers, because they look good on the outside, but inside they're full of rot. It's awful what they're doing. And so what happens is then 1 year later, the family will come to this tomb, they unseal it, they open the tomb, they go in, and then they unwrap the body, and they take the bones and put them in an ossuary, in a box. It's a small box, and the rich families would have these stone ossuaries, and they put all the bones inside of the box, and then they put the covering, the stone covering, on top, and then they put this ossuary, which is quite small. The longest bone in your body is your femur, so that kind of gives you an idea of how wide or how long this box has to be. It's not very long. And then they take that And inside of the family burial plot, they'll have a whole bunch of niches where they can put these ossuaries, so you can reuse your family tomb. So basically, now this table is available for the next person in your family who dies to be placed there for another year to decay, and then for them to come in and do the second burial of the person. This might make more sense to some of you when you hear the man come up to Jesus and say, "Hey, I want to be your disciple, but first let me go and bury my father." And Jesus says, "Let the dead bury the dead." And it sounds kind of insensitive because you think, well, his dad just died. The implication is, no, it's been a year since his dad died, and he wants to go and bury his father in the ossuary, in the tomb. And Jesus is saying, let the spiritually dead go and bury the dead. In the Old Testament times, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, they didn't use ossuaries. They just used pits. So they would dig out a pit in the other part of the burial tomb, in the other part of the chamber, where they would take the bones and just put them in the bottom of the pit and scatter them there. And then the next person dies and they put their bones on top of the previous people who have died. And so what you have is this pile of family burial plot. And that's why in the Old Testament you see it being such a big deal that they wanted to sleep with the forefathers. They wanted to be buried with the forefathers. Just so you know, that's what's going on in the Old Testament. But at Jesus's time, we're definitely using ossuaries by this period. So Jesus is the first one to be placed in Joseph of Arimathea's freshly carved new tomb for his family. Jesus is the first to be placed in here. The problem is he died fairly late in the day, and they don't have time to fully prepare his body for this year, as they assume, ritual. And so they have to be really fast, and it's very hurried. They just put him in there knowing that after the Sabbath is ended, they still have time to come in and prepare his body, because he died on Friday in the late afternoon. So he has 24 hours on Saturday that he's going to be in the tomb. And then on Sunday, we're still well within the limit of 3 days before they have to be totally done. And so they're going to come early in the morning to finalize the preparation for the burial process here. So they're not overly concerned. They just need to quickly get his body taken care of and secured in the place, knowing that they'll come back and anoint the body and prepare it finally for burial on Sunday morning. So that's where we begin our story with the women coming to the tomb. And I need to just point this out, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's a lot of variance here in the different stories. Everyone assumes it's pretty clear that Mark is the first gospel written. We've talked about that before. If you go to Mark 16, I want to show you something here. This is the strangest of the accounts, because what happens is you have, notice verse 1, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. So you have 3 women here. And they come to the tomb early in the morning on the first week. And you'll notice verse 2, it's very early in the morning. As they come in, they see a young man sitting on the right side. Joseph always changes the 1 to 2 in the JST. And he tells them, go your way, in verse 7, tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee, and there shall ye see him, as he said unto you. And then verse 8, and they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre, for they trembled and were amazed, neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid. Just so you know, that's where the Gospel of Mark ends. Everything from verse 9 all the way down to verse 20 is added much later by copyists centuries later, taking elements from Matthew, Luke, and John's accounts, cobbling it together and creating a more fitting or appropriate ending to the gospel, because the way all of our early manuscripts of Mark end is right there in verse 8. They didn't say anything to any man, for they were afraid. And it just feels like this cliffhanger, leaving you with nothing. And some people have said, wow, isn't that amazing how Mark ended his gospel, leaving this huge question mark? That could have been, perhaps Mark did that on purpose. The other thing that I think is more likely is, with ancient manuscripts, your most likely pages to get lost are your first and your last ones, because they're the ends. I think it's more likely that Mark finished his gospel. We just don't have the last page. And it's possible we don't have some of the first pages too, because his gospel picks up so abruptly at the baptism of Jesus. In other words, what I'm saying is don't read verse 9 through 20 looking for any doctrinal clarity or better understanding of exactly what happened, because it wasn't written by the same person who wrote the rest of this gospel. And that shouldn't bother any of you, other than to think, okay, well, somebody much, much later wanted to give a little better closure to this gospel, so they added these words. That's totally fine. But so we won't look to Mark for our best source on what happened here, because so much of his gospel is missing. If you go to Luke 24, Luke's account is very interesting, because here you have the women who came, and Luke mentions, once again, this shouldn't surprise you, Luke is going to mention more women than any of the other gospels. John only gives you one woman going there, which is Mary Magdalene. Matthew gives you 2 women. Luke gives you 3 women, and Mark gives you 3 women, and Luke gives you multiple women. Look at verse 10. It was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and other women that were with him, which told these things unto the apostles. So they had gone to the tomb early in the morning. They had seen the tomb empty with the stone rolled away, verse 2, and the body of Jesus isn't there. So they run back. And keep in mind, this is early morning, Sunday, when they've gone to do this with the ointments and the spices. There's something profound about that to me, that it was all women who went to the tomb to prepare the body of Jesus for this, for his final burial. And look at verse 11. When they came back and told these things unto the apostles, at the bottom of verse 10 there, their words seemed to the apostles as idle tales, and they believed them not. Understand that from Peter and James and John and the other apostles' perspective, the culture in which they live, women are not seen as valid testifiers, valid witnesses in a Mosaic court of law. And they seem to just be following that pattern here. They're like, oh yeah, idle tales. The women didn't know which tomb to look at or something. They're deceived. So it's fascinating when this happens here. If you jump over to John's account of this, he gives a little more detail here, that she, in this case, it's only Mary Magdalene in verse 1, when it was yet dark, she had gone to the sepulchre. And then look at verse 2, she runneth and cometh to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved. We know who that disciple is. That's John, the author of this book, most likely. And she saith unto them, they have taken away the Lord. So Peter, in verse 3, went forth, and that other disciple, John, came to the sepulchre. And then, how do you like verse 4? So they ran both together, and that other disciple did outrun Peter and came first to the sepulchre. I just have to smile. I like that. John beat Peter in the foot race to the tomb on that morning. He, stooping down, looked in, saw the linen clothes lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter finally came, went into the sepulcher, and they see everything laid there and wrapped together. And then they leave and they go back. They've now seen the empty tomb. We don't know the order of events for sure. This is really difficult because of the different views from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, telling different elements of the story. So we don't know how it exactly pieces together. But it seems to make a little bit of sense that Mary Magdalene has come back to the tomb, but she wasn't running, she wasn't racing them, she had nothing to prove. And so by the time Peter and John are finished at the tomb and leaving, she now comes there, and she just, verse 11, she stood without weeping. And as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the sepulcher. And that's where she sees two angels. And they say, "Woman, why weepest thou?" And she says, "Because they've taken away my Lord." And then she turned herself back and saw Jesus, but she didn't know it was Jesus. Thinks it's the gardener. And then he says her name, verse 16, Mary. And then she says, Rabboni, and runs to him. Now you'll notice here in verse 17, there's an issue with our KJV English here. Jesus saith unto her, "Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father." The Greek word there is not really don't touch me, stay away, stay back. The Greek word there is better translated as let go of me. Okay, don't hold me anymore. In other words, she's come up and she's hugging him. And he finally has to say, okay, let me go now because I haven't yet ascended to my Father. Go to my brethren and say to them, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. Once again, Jesus is using Mary. He's using women as the first witnesses of his tomb, and now he's using Mary as the first witness, eyewitness and tactile witness of his resurrected body, to go and teach his brethren, the apostles, about his resurrection and his empty tomb. I think Jesus might be making some gentle commentary on their societal view of how they see the daughters of God in this particular time period, that he's using them as his witnesses, kind of like it was women who were the witnesses of his coming way back with Mary and Elizabeth at the story in Luke chapter 1 and 2. So now the story progresses. She goes and tells them that as Jesus now ascends to his Father. Now, you guys, I have to just say this anecdotally, kind of from a personal perspective. If you were to ask me, okay, Brother Griffin, you can pick one event in all of the history of the scriptures to be a fly on the wall and to a just silent observer, which event would you pick? It would be the one that's not included here. It's in verse 17 where he says, I have not yet ascended to my Father. I would love to be a fly on the wall up there as Jesus ascends in his resurrected, glorified, perfected, triumphant body of flesh and bone, having fulfilled the infinite atonement, and then for the first time presenting himself, saying, Father, I've completed all that thou gavest me to do. And the Father welcoming him home into those arms of his love and of his power, that father-son reunion I would love to witness, but probably too sacred ground. And I probably sin in my wish, but there you go. Now let's go back to Luke for a couple of little stories here that take place. You get first the story of the road to Emmaus. In verse 13, you get Cleopas in verse 18 and another disciple. We assume it's probably Cleopas and his wife, but it could have been two men. We don't know. And they're walking this whole way. And Jesus is asking them questions, and they're asking him questions, and they're saying, man, don't you understand what's been going on around here? Jesus has been crucified, and the whole time their eyes are blinded to him and his reality, and he's sharing scriptures with them. Notice verse 27. He begins at Moses and all the prophets, and he expounded them all the scriptures, the things concerning himself. And he's explaining all these things, and they're thinking, oh, yeah, okay, this is all just a fulfillment of scriptural prophecy. And then they come near to the village of Emmaus. And here's where verse 29 comes in. They constrained him, saying, abide with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is far spent. And he went in to tarry with them. That's the verse from whence we get our two hymns, Abide with Me and Abide with Me, 'Tis Eventide. Hymn number 165 and 166. Really powerful. As he goes in with them, and notice he then break bread in verse 30. After blessing it, he brake it and gave to them. And their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished out of their sight. I wonder if there's anything there for us to consider in the 21st century about recognizing more fully things we didn't see before in the breaking and the blessing and the passing out of bread, that we might be able to recognize more fully the Savior rather than just strangers. There's probably something there for us to explore, where we can more fully recognize the Lord and his influence in our lives at that experience with the sacrament. Notice verse 32. After their eyes are open and he's gone, verse 32, they said one to another, did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us by the way, and while he opened up to us the scriptures? So they're thinking back, remembering, wait, we should have known this is who it was, because our hearts were burning as he was sharing these things with us. This was really powerful, and we missed it. It's a good thing that never happens to us today. It's a good thing we never miss opportunities to recognize the Lord speaking to us as we go along, huh? So they come back, they tell the 12 that are actually the 10, because we've lost Judas and Thomas isn't with them, so we've only got 10 there. And while they're speaking, the Lord comes and appears to them in this beautiful opportunity for them to collectively experience his resurrection. Look at verse 39. Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones as ye see me have. This is kind of significant because Luke is the physician. Luke is the one who's the most focused on the physical, corporeal nature of humanity, and in this case of the resurrected Christ. So he's focused on, look, a spirit doesn't have flesh and bones. He has never mentioned blood, because blood represents mortality. Jesus doesn't have blood in his veins anymore. He shed his mortality, his mortal blood, through the atonement. But he has flesh and bones, and he tells them, come and feel them. Well, there's one of the 12 that wasn't there. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about him. His name is Thomas. And unfortunately, we've collectively as a group, we've labeled him or given him a title of Doubting Thomas. And the problem with that is Peter and John didn't believe the women when they told that they had seen the empty tomb. But we don't call them Doubting Peter and Doubting John. Unfortunately, we like, as a culture, we like to define people for some reason by a moment of weakness or by a moment of struggle. So I hope that you won't refer to Thomas as Doubting Thomas, but rather the guy who back before said, let's go to Jerusalem with Jesus and die with him, when he told them that he was going to be taken by the chief priests and killed. It was Thomas who said, let's go and die with him. Let's define him by that moment rather than this moment here. So Thomas told them, look, and by the way, Thomas is a twin. That's what the word Didymus means. Thomas, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came, back in Luke 24. So they said, we've seen the Lord. And his response in 25 was, except I shall see in his hands the prints of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. So after 8 days, they're again gathered. And then Jesus came, the doors being shut, and he stood in the midst. And then this is Thomas's opportunity. He talks one-on-one to Thomas. Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless, but believing. And Thomas answered and said unto him, my Lord and my God. Now, this story, it's a powerful story that's 2,000 years old. But let me show you the power of the story today. Verse 29, for me. Jesus saith unto him, Thomas, because thou hast seen, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. There may be some of you in the class who have serious questions. Maybe some of you have serious doubts or struggles or wrestles in mortality. And you're looking for answers. You're looking for solutions. Maybe you sat through general conference waiting for something to clarify this question or this concern or this struggle or this wrestle that you're facing. And maybe you didn't get what you were looking for. Maybe you walked away hearing other people talk about how wonderful the conference was. And for some of you in this class, you're thinking, I don't know how much longer I can hold on. I don't know. I don't know what is happening with my faith or with my belief. For you, verse 29 is really important. You don't have to see. You don't have to hear. You don't have to have a quote to know certain things about how God feels about you. Because thou hast seen, thou hast believed. But blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. If you're struggling, or if you know somebody who's struggling, my invitation is to trust Jesus, move forward in faith, even though you don't have all the answers, even though it's really painful, even though it feels like you're bearing a cross, like Simon of Cyrene, having to carry the cross for the Savior. The reality is if you're willing to continue to bear that cross, the day will come. For some of you, it will be sooner, some of you will be later, but the day will come when those answers will be given, and you will be more blessed for having believed and held on to the faith without seeing, without having an absolute certainty. And there's something powerful about that stretch of your faith, that exercise of your faith and deep trust in God as you move forward. Now, let's go to one more passage here, chapter 21. Peter and the apostles, after some days, they end up going back north to Galilee, and they're struggling to know what to do. Elder Holland gave a great talk on this many years ago in General Conference, where he said Peter's basic response to the group was, well, we had a great 3 years. It was a good run, good times, and that's over now. So I'm going to go back to my old life. Verse 3, Simon Peter saith unto them, I go a-fishing. So a bunch of the guys go and get in the boats with him, and they go out fishing. And look at the bottom of verse 3. That night they caught nothing. And when the morning was now come, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples knew not that it was Jesus. And so here's the Savior yells out to them on the ship, children, have ye any meat? And they answered him, no. And he says, cast the net on the right side of the ship, and you shall find. They cast, therefore, and now they were not able to draw it for the multitude of fishes. Can I just say that sometimes in our life, we go back to our comfort zone. When we struggle with certain things, we go back to what we've always done in the past. Same techniques, same people, same types of relationships. And that night they caught nothing is kind of symbolic of what happens when we try to do it our way, when we go back to our own best thinking alone and not focus on the Lord. So here's Jesus saying, take your nets and cast them on the right side of the ship. Put them on the other side of the boat. There are times when it's a really good thing in your relationships to try something different under the direction of the Holy Ghost, to seek the Lord's guidance in a different way. They throw them onto the other side of the boat, and all of a sudden, boom, their nets are filled. And at that point, John recognizes. Look at verse 7. Therefore that disciple whom Jesus loved saith unto Peter, it is the Lord. And when Peter heard this, he put on his fisher's coat and jumped into the water to swim to shore. You can picture that moment of realization where he says, wait a minute. This happened one other time. It was 3 years ago. Back to our story from Luke 5, when Jesus was on the boat at that point and they filled the nets to breaking point with fish. And John recognizes that and says, Peter, that's the Lord who did this. So Peter, recognizing him, jumps in the water, swims to shore, and they bring the net with the fishes in. And as soon as they were come to land, they saw a fire of coals and fish and bread prepared by Jesus. So they pull, verse 11, Simon Peter went up and drew the net to land full of great fishes, 153. Typical fishermen. We have to count them, right? So you can picture this, wow, 153 fish sitting there. And then Jesus says, notice this, you guys. We just caught 153 fish miraculously with the help of the Lord. But Jesus already has fish prepared for them to eat, along with some bread. And he calls them over. Verse 13, Jesus then cometh and taketh bread and giveth them, and fish likewise. And this is the third time that Jesus has shown himself to them. So after they've eaten, it's been a long night, they didn't catch anything. Can you all try to picture what it would be like to be there? Picture an early morning. Maybe the sun hasn't come over the eastern horizon yet. Maybe it has, I don't know. Picture the lapping of the water there as you're kind of on the shore area. Picture the sound of a fire crackling. You can hear the crackles. You can hear some of the sizzling maybe of the fish. You can see the bread, maybe the smell of the morning breeze mixed with the smell of the fire and the bread and the fish. You can picture the wonder in the eyes and in the hearts of these apostles as they're sitting there looking at Jesus, wondering, what are we going to do? What's going on? Why is this happening? What do we do now? And then in that moment, you can hear the voice of Jesus say, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me more than these? And Peter said, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. And he saith unto him, Feed my lambs. And then he saith unto him again the second time, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? And he saith unto him, Yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. And he saith unto him, Feed my sheep. And he saith unto him the third time, Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me? Peter was grieved because he said unto him the third time, Lovest thou me? And he said unto him, Lord, thou knowest all things, thou knowest that I love thee. And Jesus saith unto him, Feed my sheep. My dear friends, as you move forward in your own journey of discovery in life, working your way up the covenant path, if there are times when you're left feeling great loss, like these apostles had been when Jesus was crucified and then resurrected and then left and they didn't quite know what to do, I hope you'll hear the voice of the Good Shepherd whispering in your ear, Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. If there are times when you feel empty, I hope you can hear his voice saying, Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. If there are times when you feel like you don't know what to do or which direction to turn or what to do with your life or how to face a totally uncertain future and what God would have you do and how you could possibly find success moving forward into this great unknown, I hope you'll be able to hear the voice of the Good Shepherd saying, Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. You guys, this is a very relevant story for us today. As you move forward, don't keep going back to the old fishing nets that you know so well. Figure out how to become a fisher of men, a fisher of women, a fisher of the children of God, his lambs and his sheep on both sides of the veil. And I can assure you that you'll find peace, you'll find answers, you'll find prosperity, you'll find fulfillment, you'll find purpose, you'll find friendship, belonging, but most of all, you'll find yourself, and in the process, you'll find the Lord of the outstretched arms, the Lord who did indeed die on the cross, who was laid in a tomb, who 3 days later rose from the grave, breaking the bands of death, and who sits enthroned in yonder heavens on the right hand of the Father to this day. He lives and he loves you, and he's inviting you to feed his lambs, feed his sheep, feed his sheep. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, and know that you're loved.